Welcome, and we're at the Old Town Meeting House and the burying ground out behind. Let's go in and have a look around. Hi, I'm Dave Hackett, President of the Harpswell Historical Society, and here we are at the Old Common Burying Ground in back of the Meeting House. This is the final resting place of a lot of the first Europeans to come here. There are, I think, a couple of Native Americans here, but I'm not absolutely certain of that. We'll start out just this time in alphabetical order. It's Elisha Allen, and the interesting thing about this is here's a nice granite curb, nice metal fence, wrought iron fence, and it's outside of the limits of the rest of the graveyard. And I don't know why. He died in 1872, so a little later on in the life of the graveyard. Grave here is Nehemiah Curtis. He was head of the Harpswell militia before and during the American Revolution. He was described as a great patriot. The Harpswell militia, the gunpowder and shot for the militia was stored in the attic of the Meeting House. And if you go up there today, there's still two gunpowder kegs up there. And I don't know of any place that you can go into a town building and find gunpowder kegs that have been there literally for hundreds of years. It's pretty unique. And we also have one which is now in the hearse house, which is half full of powder. There's no date on it. Some of them are dated. This one is not. It has a stencil on the bottom. And we wonder, all the saltpeter is leached out of it by now, so it's basically charcoal. I don't think it could possibly explode. But I did make the mistake many years ago of telling a woman that it was up there, and she screamed at me, "David, you get that out of there before you blow up the darn building." And it was hard for me to explain to her they'd already been there for 200 years. This is Ezekiel Curtis. Ezekiel was a farmer here in town. And back when Parson Eaton was alive, Samuel Eaton, second minister here, and we'll come to his grave in a while. But Ezekiel was a farmer, and he raised turnips. And if you've ever tried to raise any kind of crops in town here, you realize the soil is mostly clay and acid, and it's hard to raise anything without a lot of fertilizer. And turnips grow in down near any soil, and Ezekiel grew some big ones. One day Parson Eaton was talking to him, and he said, "Now Ezekiel, raised some big ones, did you?" referring to his turnips. And Ezekiel's reply was, "Big's your damned old head, wig and all." In a little while, we're going to see Parson Eaton's hat and wig, and only then may you truly marvel at the size of Ezekiel's turnips. This is Parson Eaton's hat and wig. This hat and wig are older than the United States. And if you take that off, you realize the horsehair wig doesn't cover the top of your head. Your tricornered hat does. You might wonder how long these trees have been here. There's a rather large group of oak trees along in here, and you wonder how old they be. Some people think they're as old as the town is, and this is Octavia Merriman, wife of Captain Harold Merriman. And I don't believe when her grave was put here that the roots of this tree were growing here. She died in 1869, and these trees are obviously after 1869. This is Alcott Stover Merriman. He sailed around the world in square-rigged ships, Harpswell ships. And in the Historical Society Museum, we have his writing desk, which is kind of the iPhone of the 18th century. It's a nice piece of material, and a lot of history goes with it. Alcott was a fine man. This is Captain Charles Johnson. His first wife was Mary, and she died in 1837. He died in 1887 at 93 years old. And his Eloise, his wife, she lived to be 86 years old. And there's an interesting story here. He was also in the War of 1812. In looking at gravestones and trying to understand as much as you can about him. Every once in a while there's something that pops up that you go, what's the story here? Now, most stones don't have any writing on the back side of them. And Mary's stone has this on the back of it, erected by Captain John Bishop. And you got to wonder, what is the story behind this? Was Captain Childs way off in a sailing ship when she died? I don't know the answer to that. I wish I did. But that's about the only stone that I've ever seen like that, when the backside said erected by someone other than a family member. Or at least I don't think he's a family member. I may be mistaken about that too. Grave here is Joseph Clark, and he was a sea captain, and it says that he died in New Orleans on June 18th, 1857, aged 31 years, 7 months. Wonder what happened to him in New Orleans. Big port, port that's used a lot by Harpswell sea captains. What happened? I don't know the answer. This is Seth Toothaker. He was a soldier of the Revolution, and he lived to be 91 years old. A lot of people, when I give graveyard tours here, will say, you know, I didn't think people lived to be very old back then. Well, they did. They lived to be well into their 90s. We'll come to a stone here in a little bit that is of a child that was 2 years old when she passed away. And there are a number of stones of infants here. But a lot of people here live to be very old. This is Captain Charles Bishop. And Captain Charles was married to Sophie for a number of years. And she sailed with him on sailing ships. On a trip to England, Charles was the captain of the T.J. Southard. And a bad storm came up and they were wrecked off the coast of England. The ship was a total loss. And the newspapers at the time said that they were rescued after very great difficulty. So as a young woman, she lived through a shipwreck. It's got to be a pretty terrifying thing. But if Sophie hadn't died young and Captain Charles hadn't married Alice Elizabeth, I wouldn't be standing here right now. These are my great-grandparents on my father's side. This Captain Schubel Merriman. Along in this part of the graveyard, there are a number of sea captains. And Captain Schubel, like a lot of them, sailed around the world. Some of these guys knew places like Singapore better than they did Brunswick. Or maybe that's an exaggeration, but I don't think it's a huge exaggeration. But Captain Schubel died at 92 years and 3 months. He had a long, successful life. This Captain Clement Schofield and his wife Elizabeth, she was a Given. And he sailed on Schofield vessels for most of his life and sailed to faraway places. But the interesting thing about Captain Clement is when he retired, and I won't get the dates of this exactly right, he served two terms in the Maine legislature and 2 terms in the Maine Senate. And after retiring from the life at sea, I wonder what he thought of doing business in Augusta was like. This tall stone here is Bethia Schofield, and she sailed with her husband, Captain Robert, on the ship Sam Dunning a number of times. And on one trip, they were at the Chincha Islands off the coast of Peru, and that's where guano comes from, the original fertilizer. And everything that I've read written by a man, this is a terrible place. It's right on the equator, it's hot, the air's full of ammonia, it's just a terrible, terrible place. And Bethia writes to her mother in 1847, "There is good and civil society here. There is some 16 American ladies and some English." Well, when they were there were labor shortages because nobody wanted to shovel the stuff, and there were 100 ships waiting to load. And it was valuable cargo, so they certainly would wait. She became pregnant on that voyage, and when they came back here, she stayed at Liberty Farm up in North Harpswell, and she unfortunately died in childbirth. Her life must have meant a lot to Captain Robert, because this is quite a stone. This is Captain John Bishop. He's the older brother of Captain Charles and his wife Margaret. And Captain John was a steely-eyed guy. He sailed on the T.J. Southard a number of times. He sailed on Schofield vessels, spent a lot of time at sea. And we have, in our museum, we have some artifacts that belong to people at these graves. And one Sunday afternoon, a little old lady came in with a sextant box in her hand. And she said, "David, this belongs here." And I said, "Well, thank you." And I took down her information. And I opened it up, and it's an English sextant, a very nice one. And most sections have a wooden handle. This one has an ivory handle with a sterling silver plaque on it. And it says, "Presented by the British government to Captain Bishop of the U.S. ship Jane Southard of Richmond, Maine. Acknowledgement of his kindness to a portion of the crews of the brigs Lero of Nova Scotia and the Albion of Marysworth in February of 1868. So on a transatlantic voyage in the wintertime, a bigger square rigger comes across two smaller vessels sinking, and he manages to, him and his crew, to put the vessel up into the wind enough so they could rescue parts of the crews of either one of these vessels. And if you ever looked at a square rig ship and see the amount of lines that are on there to be able to change the sails and stuff, it's a Herculean task to be able to turn that around and up into the wind without being 5 or 6 miles away. He was quite a guy. This is Thankful Stover. She was born in 1832 and died in 1834. And I don't know of any other child named Thankful. I'm sure there are people named Thankful, but I've never heard of it, and I wonder, you know, how did this come to be? You know, what is the origin of the word for the Stover family? This is Hannah Stover. Now, a lot of you have heard of the witch of Harpswell, Hannah Stover. Well, this isn't her. And there is a wonderful story about Hannah Stover, the witch, who was not a witch, who was brought up here by a group of women, not be allowed to be buried here. And it's quite a nice story, but that's what it is. It's a story. It was done, I believe, for a children's magazine contest. And every year I bring a number of people out here. They come to the museum and say, well, I'd like to see Hannah Stover's grave. And I said, yep, sure. So we come here to Hannah Stover, and they look at me like I don't know what I'm talking about, and said, well, she died in 1884. I said, yeah, that's the only Hannah Stover here. And sometimes they're happy about that, and sometimes they, well, no, that story's true. I know it's true. But this is Hannah Stover that's here. Gravestones come in quite a variety of shapes and sizes and materials. And some of the older ones are slate, like this. And this is Susan Dunning. She died in 1797. But what's of interest here is what you see here. This is a death head. They're quite common on gravestones of the period. This Mr. Israel Dunning died in 1802. And what's of interest here beyond him is this urn. A number of stones, like death heads, have urns on them. This is a stone of Mary Randall, and she died in 1790. But hers is not a death head, but an angel. This is Stephen Decatur Johnson. He lived in the house across the road from us here, and we have his writing desk. His son Gershom is buried in the Hillcrest Cemetery, and Gershom is someone I knew as a little kid. And my father used to take me up to visit Gershom from time to time, and he had been a sailor in the 1870s and 80s and 90s. And he also made ship models, and we have 2 of his ship models. He made, I think, Gershom made, I think, 9 trips around Cape Horn. And if you've ever seen any pictures of a ship, sailing ships going around Cape Horn, one time would have been enough for me. This is Miriam Johnson, and she died in 1877. And this stone is unique here in this graveyard. It's cast out of pot metal, and that was a kind of a fad for a while, a few years. It was an alternative to stone cutting, and it's a nice stone, but it is cast rather than carved. This is Mariah Johnson, and she died in 1865. But what's of interest here, beyond her, of course, is this angel with a fist raised. And I've never seen one with a fist raised, and I wonder what the significance of it is. This is Alberta Frances Allen, wife of Harry Allen, 1891 to 1944. She's the last one to be buried here, and it's a good 50 years between her burial and the next one back. She must have had quite a connection here to be able to be buried here. This is Caleb Curtis and his wife Hannah. Hannah died at 42 and he died at 92. But there are a lot of epitaphs in this graveyard, and this one is my favorite, a soldier of the Revolution. There are 8 or 9 Revolutionary War soldiers buried here. This is Olivia Hodgkins. She died in 1836, 3 years and 6 months. And next to her are her father and mother. This is Dexter Morse, and Dexter moved here from someplace, I don't know exactly where, to be with Emmeline Morse, his wife. And he was in the Civil War, and I believe that he spent most of his time in the Civil War down in the Mississippi area building roads for the Union troops to come forward on. This is Mary Eaton. She was also known as Aunt Mary Eaton, and she died in 1900 at 90 years of age, and she lived in the next house to us. This is where Aunt Mary Eaton lived, next to the church, next to the meeting house. And we have a couple of photographs of her and her sister, Emmeline, on that front porch about 1900, about the year she died. This is Elisha Eaton, first minister of the meeting house behind us. And his son Samuel was the second minister here at the meeting house. And together they were ministers here for 68 years. Just imagine how much influence two men would have on a town in 68 years. They were both graduates of Harvard College, and they were also lawyers and doctors. The influence these two men had on this town is huge. And over here is to the memory of Catherine Eaton, the virtuous relic of Mr. Elisha Eaton. Now, have you ever heard that term before, virtuous relic? It just means that she lived longer than he did. This is Deacon Andrew Dunning, who was chosen deacon of the church in this town on June 17th, 1767, which office he fulfilled until his decease on March 27th, 1808. Deacon Andrew had a lot to do with the formation of this town, and it may well be called Harpswell because of some connection that Deacon Andrew had to Harpswell in England. This is to the memory of Benjamin Dunning, Esquire, who with the utmost of composure breathed his last on January 8, 1808 at 71. As a husband, parent, Christian, and civil magistrate, he was conspicuous. Now think about that word in this day and age and what it might have meant back in these times. The town for which many years he represented the Board of Overseers of Bowdoin College, and fine and civil society is deprived of a useful, wise, and peaceable member. That's quite an epithet. This is Jane Berean. She died in 1879, and this is the only stone that is a cross in this cemetery.